Welcome to Shares from the American College of Financial Services, where money meets minds. Here's a look at what we'll be sharing with you today.
Its database that it was trained on is sort of what's out there in the world. And for some reason, whatever some of these incorrect answers that are maybe being shared on, discussion posts or forums or something like that, some of that must just be incorrect.
I'm Chet Bennetts, Director of the college's Chartered Financial Consultant and CFP Certification Education Programs, and I'm your host for this conversation on specialized knowledge. We're joined today by Eric Ludwig, Director of the college's Retirement Income Certified Professional Program. Eric, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us.
Thanks so much for having me today, Chet.
Well, let's start our conversation with a bit of personal background. You asked me a bunch of questions last time, and I'm going to flip the script. So, as some of our listeners know at this point, you're also a host of this podcast talking about retirement planning topics. But you and I have been collaborating for quite a while on the subject of artificial intelligence and its use in financial planning. We're going to get to that, but let's hit these questions first. So, how did you get into the financial planning world? What was your journey?
What actually happened is my dad was a CFO of a company, and for him, he just talked to me. Like, for him, his personal hobbies was investing, and he kind of managed their company's 401k plan. And he would just kind of instill me with different little bits of advice. And some of them were just simple, like, hey, Eric, when you start working, make sure that you always save 10 or 15% of your income. And I never really realized that some of those little things that he taught me when I was growing up I just thought that like everybody's parents talked to them that way. I really did not realize that until I was actually working as an airline pilot, which I know doesn't really make sense as to how I became a financial planner. But when I was a pilot, I would start talking to guys I was flying with about like what was going on in the markets and what they were doing with their 401k. And I realized that these people that were super smart people that, had been smart enough to be pilots still didn't actually know much about investments. And some of these guys were like nearing in on retirement. I remember thinking like, oh my gosh, you're a couple years out and you haven't actually done some of the planning and stuff that my dad had kind of told me that I was supposed to do when I was like 12. And so kind of what happened is, I know we talked about this in your episode, that how like external events play a role. And we both talked about this September 11th connection. For me, what it was is the airline industry was so goofed up after that my schedule and my pay was actually so horrible that I needed to find something else to do. And I realized that like, having these conversations with pilots around money, I'm like, oh man, there's actually a job in this. It's something called a financial planner. And so my wife worked in a bank and found out that the guy that was the advisor in that branch was retiring. And I found out who his boss was, and I just kept bugging him to get an interview. And finally, he's like, all right, fine. If you're going to be that pushy, I guess we'll just talk to you. And so that was actually my start. So that was September of 2007. I started as a financial advisor.
Wow. Kind of an interesting time to go into the airline industry and be part of it during 2001, and then be part of the financial industry right in 2007. I'm sure there's another story there, but now here we are. Both of us are practitioners, and jokingly, but not, call ourselves pracademics, because we're practitioners that moved into this academic world. How and why did you make that decision to move into the academic world?
Starting as an advisor in September of 2007, I honestly thought that being an advisor was all about like building optimal portfolios. I really did think that that's what, because I was viewing this through like the world of like investing. And what actually happened is like, because my first 18 months on the job as an advisor was during, the Great Recession, you start seeing people do things that were like obviously not going to be good for their future retirement planning, like selling low and moving to cash and things like that. And it made me just think like, man, I really wish there was a way to sort of identify who these people are. So that was one. And then the other was like, okay, so great. So maybe you've identified those people, but then like, what do you do about it? What are the types of conversations and stuff that you should have with those sort of people? And, like you, I know we go down these rabbit holes of interesting topics. And I kind of realized like, oh, wait a minute. Like you had kind of mentioned in your episode, some of this stuff hasn't been that well researched. And so it was like, okay, the research chops that I had at the time were minimal, right? Like I had a master's degree, but it was clearly not going to be enough knowledge to like actually research this in a right way. So that was what kind of led to the interest in pursuing the PhD.
That's how we met and engaged, and we kind of both are making decisions about things at weird times because we both started in the PhD program in August of 2020. In the midst of a pandemic is when we started our PhD journey together and have worked together since in research. But do you have a favorite failure along your process? In other words, is there something that, again, seemed like maybe a setback, but ultimately set you up for future success?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was like growing up, I always wanted to be an airline pilot. And I mean, so much so that like I started taking flying lessons after my junior year of high school. So if you can imagine, I mean, I spent so many years like just focused on that one goal. And when that career path didn't really work out, it felt like a huge failure. It felt like I had wasted, the previous 6 years of my life going down a certain path. When I first made the transition to being an advisor, it felt like still another failure of like, oh my gosh, my timing in careers is just horrible. But I mean, now, sort of with the benefit of hindsight, it's been just an amazing process. And I'm so glad that I made that transition from pilot to this financial planning world.
Yeah. Okay, last one, promise. Best and worst investment, or best, and obviously doesn't have to be a financial one.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I guess this is fair game. I asked you this. I think for me, if I can have two bests, the first one that comes into mind, I guess, would be like personal health things. I feel like I kind of view that as like my chassis through life. And then I just know that if I don't take care of myself, that shows up in a lot of other areas. So it's for sure that one. And then the other is just, simple things like my wife and my daughter are just super important to me. So kind of thinking of that as an investment of like what I get back in return is hard to measure. So I think of like of the energy that I have, knowing if I invest that in my relationships with them, it pays me much more dividends, I guess, to use the investment term.
Well, we know we're going to have at least one listener because Eric's going to make sure his wife listens to this podcast, right? Okay, let's move on to the kind of the meat of what we're talking about here now. Last time you and I visited in a previous episode, we talked about the retirement income literacy survey that we at the college have done. This is our fourth iteration, spanning back over a 10-year period of asking consumers questions that pertain to how knowledgeable they are about retirement topics. And as we indicated last time, this last wave in 2023, if we're scoring it on a percentage basis, which is how we scored this, consumers that responded to this got about a 31%. 31% of the answers correct. Those that had an advisor did a little bit better, which is an important role that we're going to discuss a little bit today. But we, of course, because we have been working in AI and specifically generative AI research for a while now, we wanted to look at this a little bit differently. And before we get into the results of that, Eric, tell a little bit about your arc, which I'll say is probably our arc because we were doing it around the same time. Like, what got you into AI? What made you say, this is interesting about generative AI specifically, and what's kind of been the path in your research and presentation endeavors?
Yeah. Well, now that I'm done with the PhD, I think I can probably more clearly explain that how it actually came about, if I'm totally truthful, is that you and I had a class together that was using this advanced statistical methods. And I remember it came down to the point of the sort of the research process where you have to start writing. And for me, that's my biggest struggle. I like doing the research part. The writing is challenging. And I specifically remember thinking, man, it seems like there's got to be some sort of AI tool that would help with this. And I remember just literally Googling something along those lines. And this thing came up from OpenAI, and I'm like, I don't know what this is, but I'll try it. And I can remember my first actual prompt that I typed in was something about, I'm writing a research article on whatever it was, and can you please provide me with a list of references? And I can remember that what those references were actually made up. And so I know you and I have done a bunch of other research on this since then, but that was actually my first thing. It was really from like knowing, hey, there's probably some efficiencies that could help me from a writing perspective. And it just happened to be that is now ChatGPT. So you and I think both sort of accidentally discovered it in November of 2022 when it, just sort of first came out.
I don't remember my first prompt necessarily, but I think it was something where I was trying to get a summary of something. Like, hey, this theory, give me a summary of it, or explain it as if you're explaining it to a high school student or something. And yeah, we both just were like, holy cow, this is an amazing tool that has good power that can be used for good or evil, right? It has powers that are pretty amazing and can be used for good or bad. And in our PhD journeys and educational environment, we saw it kind of firsthand in how other people were adapting it and finding that there was this hallucination is what it does when it kind of makes up answers, especially with references like that. And actually starting to see it creep up in work from academics of people using it and maybe not knowing fully about it. So yeah, I know that you and I were early adopters. I think we were both in the Google Bard beta project as users and began doing some things with testing if there was bias and all kinds of stuff. So we spoke about that a lot last year at various conferences and have written papers about that. So I guess it's not a huge surprise that when we started looking at the Retirement Income Literacy Survey and saying, hey, we have all these human respondents, and we've referred to them as DNA respondents as opposed to AI respondents. We have these DNA respondents who haven't scored very good in these areas. And trying to wrestle with that, like, what does that say? If this has consistently been bad, from a research standpoint, what is that saying? Does it say something about what's available out there? Does it say something about the information that consumers are utilizing to make these decisions? And again, no big surprise, we're like, hey, let's see what ChatGPT would do with this. So talk through a little bit about what we did and then what the findings were in this initial little push that we did of having ChatGPT answer these questions.
So, I mean, you and I, we've been talking about kind of the use cases for ChatGPT for financial advisors. Knowing that we've been also working on this literacy study, we were like, man, I mean, it seems like this all-knowing thing. Granted, we know that there's errors and stuff that pop up with it. And that's kind of the purpose of our presentation has been to be like, hey, look, depending on what you're using it for, buyer beware, be careful. So we just thought, hey, it's a Friday afternoon. Why don't we just see how, in this case, it was ChatGPT, how would it do if it took the survey? Do you remember what you thought, like how well you thought it would do? Do you remember the score that you thought it would get?
These are objective, knowledge-based questions. There's not a lot of subjectivity to them. And since it has the full expanse of all information on the internet, I mean, I was going to be shocked if it got less than 80%, to be honest, because it was just like, well, maybe it just misinterpreted or it hallucinated or whatever. But in my opinion, I thought it was going to get 80. Were you kind of in that same thought process?
Yeah, I thought the same. I'm like, honestly, it's like, okay, it should ace it. And then I thought, to your point, I thought the only reason it's going to get one wrong is maybe we just wrote the question wonky and it misunderstood it. Or the other reason I thought it was going to get one wrong is because like when you and I have tested it, we'll see that sometimes it doesn't have access to like the most up-to-date data.
Sure.
I think it's like April 2023. And I know when you and I have asked it questions about like the required minimum distribution rules is still sort of referencing
old numbers. Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe I'll get that one wrong because it's just out of date. So I was like, okay, yeah, probably like 90%, 80, something like that.
Well, and knowing that other researchers have had ChatGPT take standardized exams like CPA exams, CFA exams, medical exams, bar exams, and it's passed. And those are also objective questions. There's not a lot of subjectivity in those either. So talk about what we actually found.
The American College of Financial Services, championing causes, connecting communities, delivering best-in-class applied financial knowledge and education
for the benefit of professionals like you and for the benefit of society.
Expand your opportunities at the all-new theamericancollege.edu.
Yeah, so 37 questions. It got drum roll, it got a 45%.
45%.
45%.
Yeah, so better than the DNA respondents, the AI respondent got a 45%.
Yep.
I mean, you and I have talked about it, so let's maybe just kind of think out loud here in the form of a podcast now. Why could that be? What are some of the contributing factors to why that might be the case, that this all-knowing thing that passes medical exams and bar exams is not answering retirement income questions correctly?
Yeah, I know. And I know that you and I haven't had a ton of time to chew on this. I think one of them,
Yeah, because by the way, we've worked on this research for several months. It literally was last Friday, so a week ago. Let's give it to ChatGPT and see what happens. So we're still fleshing some of this out, and this is kind of our formalized brainstorming, I guess, huh? So what are some of the things that you've thought of when it comes to maybe what the implications are for ChatGPT failing this?
I mean, I think the first that's interesting is if we look at its score, and then we look at how our actual, like you were calling them DNA respondents, like actual people, how they responded. So we had like 3,700 people in our study. Of those, only 33 of them had $1.5 million or more saved for retirement. That small sliver of people also got a 46%. So just thinking big picture, like, okay, so cool. So of all the respondents we had this little tiny sleeve that actually did comparatively well. Like it wasn't like they got an 80% either. If I'm going back to your question, which is like, where do the errors come in? I think part of it is just like its database that it was trained on is sort of what's out there in the world.
Right.
And for some reason, whatever some of these incorrect answers that are maybe being shared on, discussion posts or forums or something like that, sort of publicly available information, some of that must just be incorrect because that's sort of what it's drawing on to answer. I don't know. What do you think? Is it something similar? Or?
If we look at both sides of the coin here, I guess someone might say, well, that's probably then an indication that the questions are flawed. Because if both humans and AI can't get it, maybe there's problems with the question. That was kind of the devil's advocate in me immediately went that path. Looking at it from a broader picture, though, I mean, it's really good, and although it has been flawed in simple mathematic functions, but it's pretty good at objective information. The problem is, and I say problem, but it's actually the opportunity for what we do as a profession, but the problem is that in financial planning, there's a lot of right answers. There's a lot of subjectivity in it. So just because a thing might be the best economically correct answer to something, if someone is worried about the longevity of Social Security based on their lifespan, maybe it doesn't make sense for them to wait till 70. Maybe they should take it at age 66. And that is an example where one of the questions is essentially asked, you're a single person expected to live to age 90. What's the best age to retire or start taking Social Security? And it got it wrong because it said age 66 when economically speaking, you're going to get the most out of Social Security at age 70. But two people that are of the same age that are single and expect to live at age 90, we're probably going to see different responses from those people if we control for everything else. So could it be that the questions are wrong and there's bad questions, and that's why both DNA respondents or human respondents and AI respondents are getting the answers incorrect? Possibly. But I think the bigger implication of this to you, what you were going down, that path is saying, look, both humans and AI only have access to the information that's available. So when a human goes out and Google searches something, or when a human goes out and asks an AI something, it's only hearkening on what information is available out there. So it's probably a more telling story to say that the information that is out there is confusing both to DNA respondents and to an AI respondent, which just further exemplifies the reason why, just as a financial advisor can help moderate really the scores on our DNA respondents, this role of the advisor and AI, both from consumers using AI, but also advisors using AI, we just need to be conscious of that, the fact that there's objectivity, but even in that objectivity in the responses, there's still, it still has the ability to be fallible. So that's that's where my mind has gone. Again, we've not had a ton of time to talk about this, but what other points along that from implications, was there something I was missing or that you would otherwise want to touch on?
I guess to me, what was interesting is just like, like you're right. Like some of the questions, you could read them as like, oh, maybe that's a little subjective. Like that's going to actually depend on that person's situations. But like also some of the ones that it got wrong are like,
Right.
so one of the questions that we asked it had 4 possible answers. One of them being, I don't know. It just, that was one of the answers. It don't know. Okay. Well, the other 3 options were very clear,
Right. Yeah. That was surprising. I was shocked that it gave, and we gave it in the prompt. If you don't know, you can respond, don't know, but it rarely did. And it rarely tells you, even in normal questions, that it doesn't know. It just makes something up that it thinks is the most likely. So that was pretty shocking that it admitted it didn't know the answer to the question, which we scored that as wrong in the survey. And researchers will discuss about how to score I don't know responses all the time, but just from our methodological standpoint, the fact that it got an I don't know response counted as an error. So,
right.
Eric, you and I have talked to, I mean, I talked a lot about it last episode of really this role of the advisor. And what else would you say as it pertains to how a financial advisor in the presence of AI or in conjunction with AI, what does the results of this kind of tell us of that?
I think the first part of this is like, okay, well, let's realize that the information that people have access to might be flawed, right? Because it's like, if that's what ChatGPT is pulling from and it's getting some of these, what we think are pretty basic questions, like even there's a question about like the effect of inflation and it got that one wrong. So there's things like that where it's like, wow, if that type of information is so prevalent and that's what people are being exposed to me, it just makes it that much more important of this role of the advisor. When you were a practitioner, and same with me, it's like you get a lot of inbound from people on a day-to-day basis of like, hey, I heard this on news last night, or I read this last night. And it's like, you're sort of like the fact checker, right? Of like, oh, yep, I know what you're talking about, but they didn't really give you the full story there. And I think that's where the role of an advisor can be super beneficial. That's what concerns me a little bit is like knowing that AI's use has just blown up. I mean, people, we've seen the numbers. It went to 100 million users within 2 months, which I think is one of the fastest adoptions of a technology. It just makes me wonder where people are going to try to answer some of these, they're not quiz questions per se, but just where they're trying to get information maybe on their own retirement plan. Like, what if that information gets kicked back incorrectly and then they don't have the filter to say, no, that's actually not right.
Yeah. And I think it goes to show too, I mean, I don't know that we've done this overtly by giving these same questions specifically to advisors, but I think we can hypothesize that if we gave these same retirement literacy questions to advisors broadly, that we would expect that most advisors would do better than consumers, and we sure would hope that they would do better than ChatGPT. But if we had a way to kind of parse it out and say, now let's look at advisors with or without specific retirement income education, what might the results be? And again, this is something hot off the press, if you will, because I think 10 minutes before we started recording this, we just did this other thing. Talk about what we did to kind of explore what that relationship might look like, specifically with ChatGPT.
Right. So we had like this hypothesis, which is what we've been talking about, is like, okay, well, let's just assume that maybe the reason that ChatGPT got some of these questions wrong in the first run is because, like we've been saying, the data that it was trained on was just sort of incorrect. Okay, so well, how would you fix that? Well, so our sort of idea or our test that we wanted to run was like, so for RICP, so the Retirement Income Certified Professional designation that I'm the director of, it has 3 courses and each course has a textbook. And so we thought, well, what if we gave ChatGPT the 3 textbooks and said, okay, so this is what our advisors have access to as they're going through this program. Now you have access to this information. So reference that. Now do the quiz again. So that was what we did like 20 minutes before we started recording. Yeah, so to cut to the chase, I mean, so the first time that we did it, just said, here's the test questions, just do it. Test score, 45%, right? Our average respondent was 31%. Now we give it the RICP 3 textbooks and do it, Out of 37 questions, it only got 1 wrong. So we got a 97% or something like that, yeah.
Yeah, 97% correct. Yeah, we're kind of having these conversations live in the form of this podcast, so we're fleshing these ideas out in real time here.
We can't just like give 3 textbooks to consumers and be like, here you go, and go get them. But I think it does highlight that, like, for some of these types of issues like retirement planning, it really is a specialized knowledge. Like, I was kind of telling my story at the beginning of, like, my dad luckily had like sort of socialized me over my whole growing up, and that I didn't realize that was unique until much later. I think this starts to show if consumers, maybe we're given more specialized knowledge, that maybe it is that specialized knowledge would actually help their scores. And granted, we're probably not going to take our respondents and take them through RICP material, but I know that the college is working on a consumer-oriented, retirement-specific program, and maybe part of what we should be doing. And again, we're just kind of throwing ideas out there, but maybe we should do like a pre and post, like give them the test before and give them after, and just see how they do on the exam.
Yeah, maybe the director of the RICP program should have a pre-test for advisors and have them take it, and then do a post-test at the end of the curriculum, right? To your point, we're not going to give consumers all this information, but the people that do have access and should be getting this information are the advisors, right? The advisor role is clearly important in a lot of areas of consumers' lives, and we can be the conduit. I'm a visual analogy person, as you well know, and it's kind of like light, right? Like a 100-watt light bulb emits light, and it goes everywhere. That's kind of like what ChatGPT has access to in consumers, the internet. It's just this broadcasting of everything. And what I think these findings tell us, with now we've given it the content, the RICP content, we've turned that 100-watt light bulb into a 100-watt laser, which is way more powerful. We've focused and blocked out a lot of the noise. And that's important for, again, consumers, because if their advisors have applied that lens to focus the information, that's huge. That's really, really important. So to kind of wrap this up, I mean, we've got a lot more conversations that we're going to have about this, I'm sure, but let's talk a little bit about the direct application to some of our listeners who obviously are advisors and working with clients. What are some of the things that are directly applicable to both their lives and their practices, and then how they engage with consumers?
I think if we're trying to boil this down to like, what are applications for advisors in this world of AI? I think the first is just to realize that it's not going to replace you, right? So it's similar conversations were happening with the robo advisor. I remember back in like 2014, 2015 being legitimately concerned, like, oh shoot, I'm going to be replaced. I'm going to be out of a job. And I know that we've heard some concerns about that with this sort of world of AI. And I think there certainly will be some job functions that will go away, but certainly for the type of people that we're, training, these financial planners, this isn't going to replace them. I think that it's, going to just help. And that's kind of the journal article that we wrote in the Journal of Financial Planning was really about that, just saying like, this is going to be a tool that's going to enhance who you are and give you an opportunity to work more on the things that you can specialize in. And then for some of these other lower function roles that you have, like sort of summarizing a meeting, that's where it's great for. So I think it's just a matter of understanding like what the purpose is and where you can use it, and understanding what those use cases are, and then making sure that that is really where you're using it, and that you're not trying to replace yourself, because it's not going to work even if you tried to.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll wrap this up and probably go from this to trying to solve all the world's problems via AI here after we're done with this podcast. But Eric, always a pleasure. Thanks again for spending some time with us today and sharing your knowledge and experience.
Thanks so much, Chet. This is great.
That's all for now, but you can find all our episodes on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and most other streaming services. Be sure to like us, follow us, and leave us a rating and review. Shares is a production of the American College of Financial Services, and we hope you join us next time as we share ideas that expand your opportunities.